Chapter 34. After Will had unsaddled and groomed the horses and placed them in Malcolm's small stable, the healer invited him and Xander to join him in a late lunch. It was a relatively silent meal, in spite of the fact that Malcolm was a genial host and made repeated attempts to draw his guests out. But Xander was obviously still worried about his lord and kept leaving the table to go and check on him.
"He'll be fine, I assure you," Malcolm told him the 5th time he slipped away.
Xander paused at the door that led to Ormond's bedroom.
"So you say."
Then he went to check that Ormond was sleeping comfortably. Malcolm smiled easily.
"He's a feisty little soul, isn't he? Even when he thought I might be a sorcerer, he was still willing to defy me," he said. "I hope Ormond knows what a good servant he has there."
But Will was deep in his own thoughts and didn't reply. Malcolm looked at him keenly.
"Is the food not to your liking?" he said.
Will muttered something unintelligible. Malcolm frowned slightly.
"We eat simply here, of course, but it's good food. We grow it on the roof of the house, and we make the wine ourselves, from pumpkins."
Again, Will muttered, lost in thought. Malcolm continued, with a slight edge to his voice.
"Occasionally, of course, a bear jumps through the window and lands on the table, and once an evil witch set fire to the soup. But apart from that, meals are usually uneventful."
Said Will. Then after a few seconds, he became aware of Malcolm's gaze fixed upon him. He looked up guiltily. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't quite catch that." Malcolm heaved a sigh of relief, now that he finally had the young ranger's attention.
"No," he said, "you certainly didn't. I've been talking the most appalling twaddle, but you didn't notice."
He smiled to let Will know that there were no hard feelings, then added,
"I had hoped for some amusing conversation for a change."
Will shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I have rather a lot on my mind at the moment."
"It might help to talk about it," Malcolm suggested. "You'll find I'm a good listener. It'll make a change to hear someone else's voice."
Will nodded gratefully. His training as a ranger had accustomed him to thinking and acting alone, but at times, he knew, it could be useful to have another opinion. "First of all," he said, "I can't understand where Buttle sprang from."
"He's the one you saw in the castle, just before Ormond sent for you?"
Will nodded. "Yes, but by all rights, he should be hundreds of kilometers away from here. I gave him to a boatload of Scandians as a slave." Malcolm's eyebrows went up slightly.
"You gave him?"
he said, and Will nodded seriously. "It would have been against the law to sell him," he replied. Malcolm nodded sagely several times.
"Of course, far more law-abiding to give him, I suppose."
He paused to see if there were any reaction, but there was none. This boy does have a lot on his mind, he thought. Then he added,
"Perhaps these Scandians of yours came ashore again. I'll ask if there's been any sign of Scandians in the area. My friends here range far and wide through the forest, and there's little that escapes their attention. They've become very good at seeing without being seen."
"We're a long way from the sea here," Will said doubtfully. Malcolm nodded agreement.
"Perhaps 80 kilometers. But the river Ussel runs inland from the coast, and it's a lot closer. At this time of year, if you were to come ashore, you'd want to get well away from the storms that hit the east coast. Of course," he went on, changing the subject slightly, "the question isn't really how he got here, but what he's planning to do."
"It'll be no good, whatever it is," Will said. "The man is a bandit and probably a murderer. It's driving me crazy to think that Alice is still in that castle with him. She's in terrible danger."
"He may not have recognized her," Malcolm said. "From what you say, she's changed her appearance considerably since he last saw her."
Will shook his head. The problem is, she's so tall. There are very few girls as tall as Alice, and she tends to stand out in a crowd. I can't take the risk that he hasn't already recognized her. He turned, hearing the door to Ormond's room close gently as Xander returned from checking his lord. The little secretary overheard the last few words. He felt somewhat guilty that he hadn't been able to pass Will's warning on to Alice.
If he has, he said, you'll need to know where they're keeping her. They'll hardly leave her in that luxurious suite she's in.
Wherever she is, I'm going to get her out, Will said, and Malcolm inclined his head doubtfully.
You're just going to walk in and take her? He said.
Will's steady gaze turned on him. I have my ways, he said simply, and Malcolm, seeing the determination in those eyes, realized that this was a very capable young man indeed. Even though he had been secluded in this forest for years, Malcolm kept tabs on what went on in the outside world. And he'd heard his share of rumors and stories about the mysterious Ranger Corps. He'd always assumed they were largely exaggerations, and none knew better than he how stories could be exaggerated and blown out of proportion. Now he realized they might be closer to the truth than he thought. He rubbed his scraggly beard. Xander resumed his place at the table and began eating with more appetite than he'd shown previously. Malcolm noted the fact.
I take it Lord Ormond is comfortable? He asked.
Xander nodded, his mouth full of food.
He's resting comfortably, he said.
Then he had the grace to look a little apologetic. Thank you for what you've done, he added, and Malcolm gave a little self-deprecating shrug. Xander turned his attention to Will.
If you're planning to go back into the castle, he said, you might need a little inside information.
Unlike Malcolm, he knew a thing or two about rangers, and had no doubt that Will would be able to make his way back inside Mackendor. Will looked at him keenly. I'm assuming that if they've discovered her identity, she'll be in the dungeons. There are dungeons at Mackendor, I take it.
There are, Xander agreed, but at this time of year they're often flooded. My bet is that if she's imprisoned, it'll be in the tower cell. It's right at the top of the keep tower, and a lot harder to reach than the dungeons. There's only one staircase leading up to it, so it's easy to guard.
Will considered the problem. It made sense, he thought. There were often several ways to get into the dungeons in a castle, but a tower was a different matter altogether.
Perhaps, said Malcolm, you might be better to abandon your plan for the moment and hope that your friend hasn't been recognized.
But Will was shaking his head before the healer had finished the sentence. No, he said firmly, I'm getting her out, and I'm doing it tonight.
How? Malcolm persisted. Be reasonable. You'd need a force of armed men to fight your way up the stairs to a tower like that.
I wasn't planning on using the stairs, Will told him. Will drew rein just below the crest of a hill that hid them from the castle. Beside him, Xander and Malcolm checked their horses as well. Malcolm rode a portly white mare that seemed to have been bred more for friendliness than speed. If they had to make a run for it, Will thought, the healer might be better to get off and trust to his own legs. We'll leave the horses here, he said. We'll be a bit obvious if we ride any further. They dismounted, and Xander tethered his horse and Malcolm's to a small tree. He looked inquiringly at Tug, and Will shook his head. No need, he said. Tug would stay where he was told. But if needed, he would come at Will's whistle. If that eventuality arose, Will wanted him free to move, not tied to a tree branch. He patted the horse's nose gently and was rewarded by a soft whicker. Now you be careful, the horse seemed to be saying. Will often believed that Tug thought his master wasn't safe if he wasn't around to keep watch over him. "Don't be a worrywart," he smiled at the horse. Then he gathered his cloak around him and set off, Malcolm and Xander a few paces behind him. They were both content to follow his lead. This was a world he understood far better than they. Will dropped to a crouch as he reached the crest of the hill, his two companions mimicking his movements awkwardly. The dark bulk of Castle Mackendor lay before them, barely 150 meters away. The trees from here to the castle had been cleared many years ago, leaving only light undergrowth so that the inhabitants would have warning of any impending attack. It was the same all around, except on the western side, where the forest grew thickly to within 50 meters of the walls. But the tangled growth itself would make it difficult for an invading force to approach with any speed or cohesion, so the original designers of the castle had left the thick woods as a natural barrier. Will knelt on one knee to survey the castle. It was a long-ingrained habit to keep close to the ground once he crested a hill, even though there was no fear of being silhouetted against the sky. The castle walls were above them, so that the mass of the land itself was behind them, not the sky. Of course, the snow that covered the ground reflected a lot more light than Will would have liked. But he was confident in his own ability to reach the castle unseen. Xander and Malcolm, however, were a different matter. "This is as far as you come," he told them softly. Xander nodded agreement. "You'll get no argument from me," he said. He crouched beside Will, squinting his eyes as he studied the castle. "There," he said, pointing. "See the light at the top of the tower?" Will followed the line of his pointing arm. The keep was the central tower in the castle, higher than the 4 others situated at the corners. At the very top, the tower stepped in, narrowing down to the size of a large room with a ledge running round it. That would make things a little more convenient, he thought. In that top section, he could see a dim square of yellow light, obviously a window. There were other lit windows at different points on the tower, indicating other rooms that were occupied. "That's the tower cell?" he asked, and Xander nodded. "It's the highest room in the tower," he said, "and I'd wager that's where your friend is. There was nobody in there as of this morning." "You say the windows are barred," Malcolm put in, and Xander turned to him. Will sensed, not for the first time, that Xander was not yet totally convinced of the healer's bona fide. "Wouldn't be much of a prison if they weren't," he replied. Malcolm gave him a long look, but decided to let the sarcasm pass. "Are they vertical bars or horizontal?" he asked. "Or is it a grating?" "Vertical," Xander told him. "Iron bars cemented into the stone." Will chewed his lip. Xander had mentioned the bars earlier, and he carried a file with him to deal with them. It would be a long and noisy task to remove one, but he couldn't think of any other way. Malcolm, however, had an alternative. Grunting slightly at the discomfort in his knees as he stayed in a crouch, he shuffled to Will's side and carefully produced a leather-bound flask. "Here," he said, "take this, but for goodness sake, handle it gently." Will frowned. After that warning, he wasn't willing to take the flask until he found out what it was likely to do. With Malcolm's background, he reasoned, it could well explode and turn him into a cloud of purple cinders. "What is it?" he asked suspiciously. Malcolm sighed at his reticence. "It's a very powerful acid," he said, "but it's quite safe." "If it's quite safe," Xander put in, "why does he have to handle it carefully, for goodness sake?" He added the last 3 words in a creditable imitation of Malcolm's voice.
"It is quite safe," Malcolm repeated, speaking very precisely, "if you handle it carefully."
"Then it's not," Xander began, but Will stopped him irritably. "Will you two stop squabbling?" he said. Then he turned to Malcolm. "What do I do with it?" he asked. The healer seemed about to make some scathing comment to Xander, but one look at Will's set features changed his mind, and he decided to ignore the little secretary.
"It will eat away an iron bar in about 5 minutes," he said. "Dig a hole in the mortar at the base of the bar and pour some of this in. It will attack the iron, and probably the mortar as well. Just keep pouring it in as it burns the iron away, but don't get any on your hands."
"Don't worry, I won't," said Will, regarding the flask doubtfully. He wasn't altogether sure that the file wasn't a better alternative. The thought of handling a substance that could dissolve iron bars filled him with misgivings.
"It's quite safe,"
Malcolm repeated. Will felt Xander draw breath to interject. "Put a sock in it, Xander," he said, without even looking at the secretary. Xander subsided and Malcolm nodded his appreciation.
"Thank you,"
he said. Then he indicated the flask again.
"There's a glass container inside that holds the acid. It's padded with straw and protected by this thick leather outer covering. You'd need to bash it into something quite hard to break the glass, although I suppose it's possible," he added thoughtfully. "You realize I'm about to climb a 30-meter tower, don't you? The possibility of bashing into something is quite real," Will said. Malcolm nodded several times. "Yes, well, carry it where you can get rid of it in a hurry. If you hear the glass break, you'll have about 10 seconds before the acid eats through the leather."
"So don't tuck it down your tights," Xander put in with a muffled snigger. This time, both Will and Malcolm glared at him.
"It's a pity I'm not a sorcerer," Malcolm told him. "I'd be tempted to turn you into a toad."
"Apparently, someone's beaten you to it," Will added. Xander looked hurt.
"I was only joking,"
he said in an aggrieved tone. Neither of them answered him, and he shuffled a few paces away, muttering in an undertone about people who couldn't take a joke. After a few seconds, sensing Will's baleful gaze upon him, he quietened down.
"Moon's almost set,"
Malcolm said. Will glanced up at the sickle moon. It hung close to the horizon. In a few more minutes, it would be as dark as the night was going to be. "I'll be off then," he said. He came up into a half crouch, but he didn't move immediately. For several minutes, he studied the landscape, taking in the natural rhythms of the night, how the low bushes stirred with the wind, how cloud shadows moved across the land. The land before him was a pattern of light and shade and subtle movement, and he absorbed it now, preparing to blend into it. Then he went, gliding forward in a natural rhythm that blended with the night itself. Malcolm and Xander watched him go, and, although they knew where he was and where he was heading, within 20 meters he seemed to be swallowed by the patterns of light and shadows and movement of the grass and bushes. He simply disappeared from their sight. One moment he was there, the next he was not. Malcolm heard Xander's quick intake of breath. For once, the little secretary was too surprised to come up with a sardonic comment. "Did you see that?" he asked, turning to Malcolm. The healer shook his head slowly.
"No, I didn't," he said. "That's what has me puzzled.